the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution. We have before us two of America's most distinguished legal commentators. They have participated in Constitution Center events, but have not been to the Constitution Center before. And therefore, it is urgently important that you recite with me our congressional mandate in order to inspire them for their rigorous debating tasks ahead. So, ladies and gentlemen, please let us remember that the National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful, so inspiring. And texting your initial response. Oh, is it recording stuff as we're?
Yeah.
Oh, how very distracting.
Yeah.
That is amazing. All right, well, let's see how we're doing.
Wow.
I think, so we're seeing an initial, oh, wow. You know, this is so thrilling that we can't begin the debate unless you stop voting. So I'm going to ask Tanea and our great town hall team if it's possible to change this slide so we're not distracted by the tallying vote. And as soon as we start, good, wonderful. We saw an initial bit of a no, but it's a close-ish vote, which is excellent because, friends, these are close legal and constitutional arguments, so you have to listen very closely to the arguments. I'm going to introduce our speakers. We're going to have opening statements, then we're going to delve into the constitutional and statutory arguments. And if we peter out on the wall, which I'm not sure we will because there's so much to say, then we might be able to squeeze in one or two questions about the Mueller report and can the president be indicted and so forth. But we're going to focus on and begin our debate on the question of the wall. And we could not have two better and more distinguished debaters to illuminate and educate us. Rich Lowry is editor of National Review. He is a syndicated columnist and commentator for Fox News, the author of Lincoln Unbound and the New York Times bestseller, Legacy, Paying the Price for the Clinton Years. Jonathan Turley is my dear GW law colleague, the J.B. and Morris Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at the George Washington University Law School. He is the legal analyst for CBS News and the BBC, as well as a member of the USA Today Board of Contributors. Please join me in welcoming Rich Lowry and Jonathan Turley. All right, let's just begin with the topic of debate. Namely, does the president have the constitutional and legal authority to build the wall? Rich, I think you say the answer is no, so why don't you lead us off and tell us why?
The answer is no. First of all, Jeffrey, thanks for having us. Thanks to all the center does to preserve knowledge and devotion to the Constitution. And it's a pleasure to be here with Jonathan, who I read and listen to with profit. The answer is no, not because I bear animus to President Trump, although I've written very many harsh things about him, especially during the Republican primaries in 2016, but I think things have kind of been patched up. I came back to my office a while ago, and I found this envelope on my desk from the White House. I was very curious what it was. I opened it up, and it was a torn out sheet of one of my columns from the New York Post. And I consider the New York Post the nation's newspaper. More importantly, the President of the United States considers it the nation's newspaper. He reads it very closely. And this is a column I'd written about how he's such a dominant cultural and political presence that there's no escaping him. Even if Republicans try to, they can't get away from him. And I thought in this column many acerbic and incisive comments, not all of them favorable to the president, but that didn't make any impression on him. What caught his eye was the headline the New York Post editors had put on this piece, which was, "There is only Trump." And he had taken out his black Sharpie pen, as is his wont, circled the headline, drew an arrow to it, and wrote, "Rich, so true, Donald J. Trump." So that's my last 3 years, that pretty much encompasses it. And I don't say no because I disagree on the policy. I support more fencing at the border. I hazard to say I'm probably the most hardline person on immigration here in the room, unless Stephen Miller is sitting back there somewhere. But this is not, he cannot do it on his own. And the way he's gone about part of this funding through the declaration of national emergency is constitutionally inappropriate and legally impermissible. So there's two slightly separate things. I'll just address them briefly. No president of the United States should ever say, if Congress doesn't do X, I'm going to do it on my own. And this is exactly what the president said. This declaration is entirely pretextual. He said he was going to do it because Congress didn't act and appropriate as much money as he wanted to. And you really don't have to closely examine the circumstantial evidence to find out it's pretextual. He told us it was pretextual on live TV during a press conference. He said, I didn't need to declare this emergency. He just declared it as a matter of convenience to build some of the wall faster. And I'm friendly with a lot of Republican congressmen who are close to the White House. And the way this funding is structured, the national emergency funding comes last. It's going to be the hardest part to spend. They're probably going to be in the next appropriation cycle when they get to this money. So I asked people to talk to the president every day, well, so why did he do it? And they said, because he thinks it sounds strong, that he's going to declare a national emergency. That is not a good reason to declare a national emergency. Now, perhaps the courts won't and shouldn't consider that, but as citizens, should not consider this a correct way to govern ourselves under a constitutional scheme. So that's why it's constitutionally inappropriate. Legally impermissible. He can declare a national emergency over anything. The National Emergency Act is very broadly and vaguely written. We have all sorts of ongoing national emergencies that none of us are aware of, having to do with political situation in Burundi or Belarus. So by that standard, there is an emergency at the border. But the business end of this declaration has to do with spending the money on his own that the National Emergency Act supposedly opens up. But if you read the statute closely, and I'm not going to get into this in detail because everyone's eyes will glaze over immediately and I'll lose this debate right now, but if you look at the statute closely, there is no way it justifies what Trump is trying to do at the border. So my bottom line is, it is wrong for a president of the United States to legislate unilaterally or to appropriate money unilaterally. It was wrong when Obama did it. It's wrong when Trump does it. It will be wrong when and if Kamala Harris or Mayor Pete does it. Period, full stop, end of story.
Thank you so much for that opening statement. Jonathan, the next opening statement is to you. Why do you believe that the president does have the constitutional and legal authority to build a wall?
Well, first, let me also thank you for the invitation and to be here with two people I truly have unbounded respect for. And it's a great pleasure to be in this beautiful building. I also have to say at the outset, because I'm contractually required to, that all the stupid things I'm about to say are not being said on behalf of CBS or BBC, which you can hear the sigh of relief whenever I say that in London and New York. I testified in Congress on the emergency declaration, and I began by noting something that Oliver Wendell Holmes said, and I'll just paraphrase it, that he basically said that if Congress wants to go to hell, I'll gladly send it there. It just has to be clear about it. And he said, that's what I do. And the point is that courts are not there to protect Congress from itself, which is why I believe this lawsuit by Congress is so ill-advised and actually could do great harm, which I could talk about in a second. But the reason why this is both constitutional and statutorily permissible is that Congress gave him this authority. And many of us for years have testified against these unilateral grants of authority by Congress. I'm a typical Madisonian scholar. I tend to favor Congress in fights with the executive branch. I'm not a big fan of executive power. And so for years, many of us have been testifying Congress saying, for the love of Mike, you need to fight for your inherent authority and stop passing these laws and passing appropriations that give presidents sweeping discretion. But Congress has consistently yielded and traded away its authority. The National Emergencies Act is the best example of that. The funny thing is, it began in with a good motivation and actually not bad language. It began with a language that said that the president can declare a national emergency, but then it only lasts if Congress affirmatively agrees with it. So it would die on the vine unless Congress says, all right, you're right. We understand you had to declare the emergency, and now we are also declaring the emergency. That was, I think, an elegant solution, and that was the solution that Gerald Ford shot down. Gerald Ford, at the last minute, said, oh, I really don't like that. So they gutted it and created this grotesque system that has a National Emergencies Act that doesn't define what a national emergency is. So a national emergency is literally anything the president says it is. So President Trump is perfectly correct in saying that he can declare an emergency on the border. Now, in terms of the Constitution, the president's given enhanced authority on the border, always has. There's a great deal of deference to that. And the National Emergencies Act also gives him greater control over the use of appropriations. And that brings us to the money. And this is why I think the Democrats are wrong to challenge this emergency declaration. Not because I don't agree with that. I wrote a column saying the National Emergencies Act allows you to rescind an emergency. So Ford changed it and flipped it and said Congress can come in and affirmatively say there is no emergency, which for political purposes will never happen. Right? Because no member of Congress is ever going to vote against an emergency, right? You don't want to be on the wrong side of rickets. You don't want to say there's no longer a rickets emergency and have some kid with rickets show up at your press conference. So nobody is going to do that, right? So practically they don't do it. There's only been one case where they sort of did it and the president actually rescinded it at the same time. So that gets to the money, and this is why I think the Congress is playing a dangerous game. I represented the House of Representatives in the successful challenge to, excuse me, I have a slight cold, to the Obamacare funding. In that case, Obama went in, he tried to get funding for insurance companies. Congress didn't give it to him, and so he unilaterally told the Treasury, just go and pay the insurance companies, which was a direct and one of the most significant violations of the power of the purse in the history of our country. And so I represented the House of Representatives. We went and we won a critical fight. And the court agreed that President Obama lacked that authority, that this was a violation of the Constitution. That was the most important win that the House had secured in decades. They are about to lose that because they're going to go into court, and I think they're going to lose this challenge. Because under this case called Youngstown, which you often hear about, the court talked about when a president can have inherent authority, when you have these conflicts with Congress. And Justice Jackson created these categories of when the president is almost unassailable and when he's in the most trouble in asserting authority. Well, the area where he is virtually unassailable is when he's acting under authority given to him by Congress. And that's what Trump is doing. And by the way, that is what Obama did not do. Obama was not given authority to do that. So this is not Obamacare. It's not the Obamacare case. This is very, very different. And then we end up in the last point, which is the last point I raised in Congress when we talked about this, where I basically said a pox on your house. because for years, many of us have been begging Congress to stop appropriating money in these massive amounts without designating clearly their use. I represented the members of Congress challenging the Libyan war. They're both Democratic Republican members. We went to court. That entire war was funded out of loose change. Obama never went for an appropriation because he didn't have to. He literally funded the Libyan war out of just money sloshing around in the executive branch. That's why you need waiters to get through the hypocrisy coming down from Capitol Hill on this. You know, the Democrats never objected to an entire war being funded on discretionary funds. So my conclusion is, yes, I don't agree with his decision, but he has the constitutional and the statutory authority to do exactly what he's doing. He may not be able to get all of these funding sources, but he's quite clever. He named about 5 or 6 sources. Even if he gets 3 of those, he has his wall.
Thank you so much for that, and the debate is well joined. So I hear both of you identify at least 3 major issues that we need to delve into. The first is, where constitutionally does the president's authority fall? Has it been endorsed by Congress, prohibited by Congress, or has Congress not spoken? Second, does he get deference in his declaration that this is in fact a national emergency? And third, does the National Emergency Act, which authorizes the relocation of funds that require the use of armed forces for military construction projects, authorize this particular action? So let's take each of those in turn. First, the Youngstown case, and this is the constitutional dimension. So as Jonathan said, Justice Jackson, when President Truman tries to seize the steel mill, says the president's authority is at its zenith when Congress has endorsed it, it's at its nadir when Congress has forbidden it, and it's in a zone of twilight when Congress hasn't spoken clearly. So Rich, in which of the 3 Youngstown categories does President Trump's action fall? And I'll just add one other fact. The original National Emergency Act allowed Congress to repudiate a presidential declaration of emergency by a simple majority, but the Supreme Court subsequently struck down the ability to do that as a legislative veto in a case called Chadha. So here, Congress did repudiate the president's action and said, we don't think it is a national emergency, but that is not enough to satisfy the 2/3 that's required to overturn his veto. So given all that, has Congress authorized the president's action, repudiated it, or is his action in a zone of twilight?
Okay, so I might slightly trample the, I think you set out 3 buckets that are setting up how you're going to question us about this. I may mess up your order here. On the issue, can he declare a national emergency? It's clear, it's obvious, he can. But you don't just declare a national emergency and get a magic wand as President of the United States. The point of the national emergency is unlocking other authorities set out in statute. And Congress was loose and vague in how it wrote the National Emergency Act. It was not loose and vague in how it wrote the statute that the president is relying on to get this additional $3.6 billion. It's 10 U.S.C. 2808. It says if you declare a war or a national emergency that requires the use of the armed forces, you can engage in military construction that is necessary to support the use of the armed forces. 3 key provisions where President Trump is 0 for 3 at the border. The border crisis does not require the use of the armed forces. This is a civilian matter and a civilian crisis that's always been policed by civilian forces. And the border is not military construction. And this also, military construction is set out also in the statute. It involves, building or reinforcing a military installation, which is also defined in the statute. And a military installation is what you think it would be. It's a bunker. It's a helipad. It's an auxiliary road for the military to use. It is not an enormous civilian structure that has nothing to do with the military. So what the president's trying to do here is totally ignore the meaning of words and just say, because it's a national security crisis, I can access these funds even though it doesn't involve any of these three standards set out in the statute. So this is where the argument fails. It's not declaring a national emergency, where I think Jonathan's right. He can declare a national emergency. It's just he can't get the money and spend it the way he wants to spend it under the statute very specifically written by Congress.
Thank you very much for that. That is a square answer to my question, because you're saying that the president is at its lowest ebb because Congress has spoken and his action is not authorized for the reasons you just said, because building the border wall does not require the use of the armed forces, and it is not military, it's not directly linked to a military installation that's required for military construction. Jonathan, what is your response to Rich's construction of Section 2808 of the National Emergencies Act?
Well, I think that part of the reaction has to be that, once you concede that he has the authority to declare an emergency, then you're sort of in that, Mrs. Lincoln, otherwise how did you like the play? Because, he has the right to make the declaration, and then we're down into the weeds. First of all, he was given billions of dollars by Congress that will be unassailable. So he can start this wall. I would think that it would be unthinkable for a federal court to enjoin that money. And the Democrats have said, well, we said you could have a particular type of wall, not the wall that you wanted. He's going to build something very similar to what the sort of see-through wall that we've already seen created, which he's happy with, apparently, for that purpose. So that money's going forward. So this wall is going to start to get built. I don't see how you could not concede that. Now when it comes to the military construction funds, the question is, what is the role of the court? You start with this just absolute yielding to the president of the authority to make a declaration. The law itself says we also give you greater flexibility in the use of construction funds. The references to construction funds are there to say we specifically give you the discretion to reuse these funds to meet the emergency that you have declared. So the statute conveys to the court, this is to facilitate the president's emergency declaration. So then the court's going to ask, all right, so I've got all of that. I think we can concede those foundational facts. Am I going to rule that this is really a civilian matter, not a military matter, and say that that violates the underlying regulations? That seems sort of odd, because the borders historically for many years were patrolled by the military. The borders of a country are generally viewed as a national security zone. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that the U.S. military has great flexibility along the border, as does the executive branch. I can't imagine a court saying, by definition, the border on our country is a civilian matter, because historically it hasn't been. And so the question is, where are you getting that from? You're assuming that because right now civilian forces are used, you're ignoring that historically it has not, and more importantly, there's nothing that says that the military cannot be used to guard the borders, which in fact it does, including the Coast Guard. So the question then is this military construction? Well, if you look at the construction definition, it actually has a lot of flexible terms in there. It's not just you can do a helipad. It's talking about creating construction linked to or facilitating the deployment of the military. Now, once again, I don't like the wall. I don't like the law, okay? But it is what Congress created. And I don't see how a court can look at that and say, I'm going to cut this so thinly to say that a wall is not military or it doesn't fit into those construction funds. There are 5 different areas that he is pulling from that have discretionary funds. And if you look historically, courts have never drawn these type of close lines. President Obama used discretionary funds all the time, including funding an entire war, including military construction funds. So I just don't see how we can change the rules for this president.
Well, it's not changing the rules. The military construction funds that have been used under this act are almost all been overseas, because that's where the military actually operates. We don't have the military arresting people at the border, because that would be hugely problematic. Yes, the military has a role in protecting the borders from a hostile foreign power. The last time I checked, we were at peace with Mexico, at least for the time being. And this so-called invasion, when Trump calls it an invasion, that is a metaphor. It's not literally true. These are minors. We've seen the pictures. They're minors, they're women, they're children. They're showing up in jeans and T-shirts. They are surrendering to the first U.S. authority that they meet, because the asylum rules as they currently apply, I don't support these rules, but the way they currently apply, they get into the country as soon as they surrender. So it doesn't matter whether there's Border Patrol or the 82nd Airborne there, they would surrender to the Border Patrol agent, they would surrender to the paratrooper, and the result would be exactly the same. The only role the military has there now is backup. They string some concerto wire, and they're basically a symbol that they're used. If you want to build them a barracks there under this law, you can. If you want to build them, again, a helipad or some auxiliary road, you can. You cannot build an enormous civilian priority that is going to be there long after the military leaves, and the justification for it as a military fortification is entirely pretextual and absurd, just because Congress didn't give you as much money as you wanted as quickly as you wanted it. That is not how our system works. That is clearly wrong. And yes, the court has shown a lot of deference to presidents on national security matters, but it does not show total deference. As President of the United States, you just don't get to say, this is a national security question, so I get to do whatever I want. And I think that's where the Youngstown Steel case comes in. Truman says, in like a real shooting war that we're involved with in Korea, and we're using up prodigious amounts of steel, that he's going to nationalize the steel industry because it's a national security matter. The court doesn't just say, oh, wait, he said national security, he can do whatever he wants. They said, no, this is impermissible. And by the same token, this torturing of words, or Alice in Wonderland interpretations of a statute that's very clearly written and that its meaning is absolutely clear, in order to fund this civilian political priority would be wrong, and the courts should reject it.
Well, I have to. We're actually having a debate here.
Yes, you are. It's a very good one. I'm just going to watch the show.
First of all, Alice in Wonderland would not cross the border. She's English, and the question is, when Rich says, "Look, those were foreign deployments," you know where the foreign deployments are? 1 inch off the border is foreign land. The fact that it's overseas as opposed to 1 inch off the southern border doesn't make any difference. It is the international border with another country. And historically, the U.S. military has protected it. Second, it's not just military construction funds. He's also taking drug interdiction funds. You read that language in drug interdiction, there's virtually no limits. Now, he is saying that drugs are coming over the border. I think Rich and I would agree with whether that is a serious problem or not on the southern border, whether there's evidence to support a great increase. It doesn't matter. On an issue of drug interdiction, when he goes to the federal court with declarations from agencies that say, yes, there are drugs coming over this border and this is a crisis, a judge is not supposed to make those political judgments. They defer generally to a proper declaration supported by these agencies. So on drug interdiction, there's even fewer limitations on that money. And when we come back to Youngstown, that's where I think dreams die for those opposing the wall. If you find yourself back at Youngstown, you're dead, because it means that you've gone back to arguing that the president was not given this authority by Congress. He was. They gave him sweeping authority. He falls under the category of greatest deference. It's virtually unassailable in making the declaration. And the declaration is a statute that expressly says that you can use these areas like drug interdiction and military construction funds. And the clear intent of Congress was that he would be given more leeway in those funds. And I think the night is over.
Just one point on this. The troops, Jonathan, are operating behind the wall. They're operating on our side of the wall. That's our soil. It's not foreign soil. And this is not, no one is going to shoot howitzers at migrants coming over the border or roll over them with tanks. This is not a military operation. And I share a lot of your contempt for Congress and how it hasn't been very jealous of its prerogatives and spending authority. But in this case, it actually wrote this military construction statute very carefully, and the words are plain. So if you, with me, actually want the system to work the way it should, and for Congress to be very specific about things. In this case, it actually has, and that's why the president should pay attention to it, the court should pay attention to it, and with all due respect, so should you.
No, but I have to say, the military construction provision is not that specific. It also includes construction designed to facilitate the deployment. It is not defined, but also the drug interdiction stuff is not very well defined.
How does a wall facilitate the deployment of the military?
That's the problem, is when you get into those doubts, a judge runs home.
This is a common sense question.
No, but under Article 3, our judges, thankfully, do not make political decisions. And if they get to a point where, well, they are not supposed to. But when they get to a policy issue of, is this really needed, that's when they run home to Article 3. Most federal judges do not make policy judgments. So if this comes down to they're just a bunch of people in jeans surrendering, a judge is generally not going to go there. A judge is going to say, my job, like Holmes said, is to carry out the will of Congress. The will of Congress was to have virtually no role in these emergency declarations. And so once again, like Holmes said, if you want to go to hell, I'll send you there.
If I could sum up what I've heard so far in this superb debate, I hear you, Rich, saying...
That's good. We started out as a discussion, then it became a debate. Now it's a superb debate.
And by the end, it will be illuminating.
Just wait for the free for all.
No, this is great, and we're doing exactly what I asked our friends to do, which is to wonk out on the legal details and separate their political from their constitutional and legal conclusions. I hear you saying, Rich, that the president is in the Youngstown Category 3. His power is at its lowest ebb because Congress has clearly spoken in this matter and has repudiated the kind of appropriation that he has demanded. And Jonathan, I hear you saying that the president's power is in Category 1. It's at its highest ebb because Congress has spoken and has granted him this authority, which he's exercising. Maybe a round on how a judge undecided about the categories should approach the deference question. There are a series of different lines of cases. On the one hand, as we saw in the travel ban case, as Jonathan suggests, judges are often deferential to presidential decisions that involve the border. On the other, as Youngstown suggests, when they think that Congress has spoken clearly, they're not deferential. And there's a final important strain, which is that there are judges and justices who think that Congress has delegated too much authority to the president and are not inclined to be deferential because they don't like these vague grants of statutory authority. So playing all that, Rich, how do you think the Roberts Court might approach this case if it heard it?
I have no idea. I'll say this, Hawaii versus Trump, the travel decision, Jonathan's right, courts show a lot of deference to the president when it comes to national security matters, but they did actually look at the statute that was at issue, and they saw the statute in black and white says the president on his proclamation or declaration can exclude any immigrant or class of immigrants. That was in the statute. That was in the law saying that the president could do that. And again, the national emergency, he can declare it. The problem he has is the statute over spending the money has to do with the use and support of the military. And again, build a barracks, fine, go to it. That's clearly authorized under the statute. But a court, all they have to do is read and apply the statute. That's a legal judgment. They don't have to make a political judgment over whether we need a wall or not. And again, I think we need the wall. I wish Congress had appropriated more money for the wall. There's no doubt that the money that was appropriated, Trump can use to build a wall. He can go back next year and ask for more. They can have another shutdown over it. They can have a big fight over it. All that is how our system works. But the President of the United States, in effect, appropriating money for his own purposes and his own project is not the way the system works. It's not the way the system's supposed to work. It's not the way it should work. And under 10 U.S.C. 2808, he cannot spend this money in this manner.
Same question, and focus on the deference and how the Roberts Court might approach it. How do you think the Roberts Court might decide this case?
Well, as usual, Rich is very honest about the governing precedent, but I think that he's engaging in the exercise of hope over experience because, Trump versus Hawaii reversed these lower courts, and many of us were saying when the Ninth Circuit ruled the way it was that it would not be upheld in the Supreme Court because they weren't affording deference to the president along the border. Immigration gets that deference because it is part of the border controls of a president. So it's not just Youngstown. Historically, repeatedly, and consistently, the Supreme Court has said that when it comes to border control, presidents are given considerable authority. And they have virtually never lost on that. And Hawaii versus Trump showed in one of the few cases where they had lost that they weren't going to lose. So the chances are that he would prevail on this. Second, the fact that the military is standing on our side of the border as opposed to invading, it's talking about narrowly defining military operations. Our military is not defined by acts of invasion or armed conflicts. They're also defined by patrolling our borders, patrolling other areas. That's part of the function of the military. Historically, they were the ones protecting the border. I can't imagine how a court would say that the borders are clearly just a purely civilian matter. They've not been a purely civilian matter, and the Supreme Court has said that. Now, finally, on 2808, I just want to note once again, there are 5 different sources of funding. And it reminds me of that guy that was on his knees looking at night under a lamplight, and the guy came up and said, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I dropped my wedding ring." And he got down, he looked all over, and he said, "You know, mister, I don't see it here. You sure you dropped it here?" And he says, "No, I dropped it over there, but the light's better here." Well, the light may be slightly better at 2808. It's not that good, but it's certainly better than the other sources. Trump doesn't have to run the table. He has funding already appropriated. He has drug interdiction, a couple of other areas. Even if they did what Rich is talking about, he'd have ample money to build his wall. But even on military construction, it is not that narrow. There is a catch-all term, a catch-all provision for funding that would facilitate, support the deployment. So unless Rich can win on a court saying this is a purely civilian matter, and I can't imagine how it could possibly say that, then I think they would even lose at that.
So it's just a couple things. One, I'm not hoping for this result. It pains me to say that this is the case. I think my position is a conservative one. It's certainly awkward for me to be positioned on the left on the stage. So there's no hope or wishfulness here. I want the fence. I want the border. I'd want that $3.6 billion. It's just the fact is he can't get it this way. And the military, Johnson says the military is patrolling the border. No, it isn't. Has anyone seen any migrants surrendering to U.S. troops? Anyone? No. It's because we have civilian agencies who are charged with actually patrolling the border. And yes, Trump has great leeway in what he wants to do at the border. He's redeploying assets and resources from ports of entry between the ports of entry to handle the migrant crisis. No one says he can't do that. Of course he can do that. He can flow immigration judges down there if he wants to. There are all sorts of things he can do. What he can't do is spend money on his own say-so in direct defiance of the clear, commonsensical wording of the statute.
We have some superb questions from the audience, and they're all about the wall, so I'm going to ask some of them right now.
Jeffrey was worried prior to this event we wouldn't have enough to debate about at the wall.
I'm delighted. The debate is now memorable. It's beyond superb. Okay, let's put a couple together because they really have to do with the definition of emergency. The first is, if the National Emergency Act does not define emergency, will the courts look to the definition in other statutes? Which one? And what if the president decides to use the military to build the wall? Can he do that? Jonathan, on both of those.
I don't believe that the courts are going to spend much time on the first part of the challenge by Congress, where they say this doesn't satisfy the definition of the act because the act has no definition. And so the court is going to say, well, here's a flash for you, Gordon. Next time you want me to actually apply a definition, give me one. Because I'm not really in the business of completing your legislation. You had the right to rescind it. You could have voted. You didn't have the votes to rescind it and get the 2/3 vote. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And that's going to then kick over to Rich's argument as to, are there limitations on these funds? But Congress, unlike the president, has to run the table. It's got to win on all 5 categories. And I sincerely doubt that it's going to be able to do that, at least if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Rich, a version of that question, will the courts look to the definition of emergency in other statutes? Which one? And another friend asks, are there no guidelines as to what is an emergency?
There are no guidelines for what is an emergency, and I think he'll win on declaring the emergency. Again, the border is more of an emergency than current existing so-called emergencies that we're living under. So I don't think that's a legal problem, and at the risk of beating a dead horse and repeating myself over and over again, it's that the underlying statute is very clearly written, and you have to torture the language and common understandings to define the border wall, which no one has thought of as a military project before. Pancho Villa is not stopping a Mexican bandit from coming across into El Paso. It's just not. We are suffering a civilian crisis and humanitarian crisis at the border that has to do not with our lack of military resources at the border, but with the way our asylum rules are applied, where you get basically, if you're a family unit from Central America and you say you feel threatened, you pass the so-called credible fear interview, which is the first step in the asylum process. 80-90% of migrants pass it. Because we can't then process the asylum quickly enough, it takes months or years, and we can't hold you for various other reasons, you're released in the country, and then you'll never be removed again. That's the problem. That is not a military problem. It's a problem, again, I would say this problem was actually created by Congress because it wrote the asylum rules, so I wish it would reverse them. But Trump also cannot on his own just rewrite those asylum rules either, because Congress writes the laws and appropriates the money. That's how our system works.
You'll notice that Rich is very, very good at this, but he prefaced his comments by making a couple of assumptions, right? He said, look, it's not a military problem because people are not pouring over the border. These are people who are just surrendering. Well, the U.S. government says the opposite, right? The U.S. government says there are drugs coming over the border. There are dangerous people that they have linked to terrorism coming over the border. I'm not particularly convinced by that, but the question comes down again to the function of the courts. When a court gets that, even if a judge believes that Trump is exaggerating, what is the range of action a judge has when you have the Homeland Security Secretary giving you a declaration that says, yes, people who are national security risks are coming over the border, drugs are coming over the border? Does a judge say, I just don't believe that? Yeah, I'm a judge with 2 clerks, and I read the newspaper, I don't believe that. Or does a judge say, I have to accept the declaration, which is generally what the court has held, and to say that it is a national security violation?
Here's a great...
Sorry, just one point, sorry. The State Department has said terrorists are not coming across the southern border. Drugs are a problem. They are not a military problem. MS-13 is a problem. It's not a military problem. We're not sending the 82nd Airborne to Long Island, the suburbs of Long Island, to crush MS-13. Those are not military problems. And we've talked a lot about going to hell in this discussion. If you can make a metaphor and then say you can deploy the military and spend whatever you want within this country, we have a war on poverty, right? We've had a war on poverty for 40 years. Does that mean the military can build low-cost housing? We have a war on drugs. Does that mean the military can go arrest and detain and interrogate drug dealers? No, but that is the way to hell and the slippery slope we're going down if we say the president can spend this money on his own say-so.
You mean like the war on poverty or the war against segregation when we sent in the National Guard?
The National Guard is a separate matter.
Okay.
If there's a riot, you can activate the National Guard.
Right.
But these are not, MS-13 is not a military problem. It's just not.
Well, it depends. I mean, see, the thing is, I happen to agree with all of that. But the question is, if you're a federal judge, and believe me, The State Department, Homeland Security will be absolutely identical on this issue once they get to court. I'm sure Rich will agree with that. They will put in declarations supporting this emergency declaration because it's a unitary executive position. And they will say that there are people coming over the border and that are terrorist linked. They will say drugs are coming over the border and creating a national security violation. The question is not the merits. The question is the function of the judge. How can a judge get those types of declarations, which she will get, and say, I just don't believe this? If she says that, she's going to be reversed in a heartbeat.
Here's a great constitutional question for both of you. Is there a constitutional basis for a unitary executive permitting the president to act without any congressional authorization on the wall and other matters, or was that decided in Youngstown? Rich?
I don't think the president can spend money on his own. He just can't. And I'm sympathetic to the argument there's a unitary executive, but the fact of the matter, we don't have a very unitary executive at the moment. Read the Mueller report and tell me how unitary it is. And the State Department has already said that terrorists are not coming over the southern border. It's more of a threat that the terrorists will come in through other ports of entry and through airports. So again, this is just, you can kind of torture common sense to try to redefine it as a military thing, but it simply is not. And at the end of the day, words have to mean something. And we don't have a constitution, we don't have laws. If words do not mean what everyone understood them to mean the day before yesterday, before the president wanted to unlock an additional $3.6 billion for this wall.
Jonathan, just to reinforce the question, Youngstown said the president does not have a residual commander-in-chief power that allows him to act in the face of congressional disapproval. But is there some other constitutional basis for a unitary executive allowing him to act without congressional authorization?
Well, first I'll quickly answer that question, then I'm going to ignore it. The answer is, I think, is that there is inherent authority that under Article 2, that some courts would allow the money to be moved around. Like I said, I litigated the Libyan war. The judge had no problem with funding that war out of money that came from all over the budget. Presidents have, for years, used literally hundreds of billions of dollars of money sloshing around. And if a court is going to start to draw that line, it's a little bit late to start doing that because you don't like this president. Now look, I haven't liked a president in my lifetime. The last president I liked was James Madison. So I am, I don't have a dog in this fight. But the courts have historically allowed the discretionary funds to be used in widely discretionary ways. It's not messing around with language. 2808 is not as clear as I would suggest, that Rich suggests. But more importantly, these other laws are written in the same maddening, broad, ambiguous way. So he's going to go into court at the height of his authority under an act that expressly gives him the right to declare a declaration, and then he's going to claim the right to use discretionary funds, which all the predecessor And he does this, I think, as a strategy. He really baits people and gets them to do really stupid things, whether it's the media or the courts, and he's succeeded. But at the end of the day, an Article 3 judge has to say, am I applying a consistent approach to prior administrations? And if they say that, he's going to get his wall.
Okay, one
For the
question.
record, James Madison, someone who didn't do a very good job of defending our borders.
Okay, now we're going to have a serious problem.
That's fighting words.
Okay,
of
if
the
you
National
want a piece of me, no.
One question to each of you, and then it's time for closing arguments in this superlative debate. For Rich, are you saying the building of a wall is a civilian matter as a matter of law? If you concede it's up in the air, have you lost?
Wait a minute, can you repeat that?
Sure. Are you saying the building of a wall is a civilian matter as a matter of law? If you concede it's up in the air, have you lost?
Still not sure I follow that question.
So I think the question is, are you suggesting that, and thank you for the question, are you suggesting that by law this is defined as a civilian matter? And if it doesn't, then don't you lose if it's not clearly defined by law?
Well, I think it's just as a factual matter, not a military function, so I win.
There's an old expression, if you can't argue the law, you argue the facts.
Nicely put. Last question to Jonathan, and then closing arguments. Professor Turley, you note that Trump's actions were explicitly authorized by Congress, but Obama's were not. If Obama had simply declared national emergency, could he have used the money Congress wouldn't give him?
That's a really wicked question. That's excellent. And the answer is no, only because of this. The regulations, the money was given to the administration. That's what the distinction between these cases, why I think I strongly encourage the House not to file this action, because I want to preserve the win we had in Obamacare for congressional authority, not the merits of Obamacare. I support national health care. But the difference is, Congress never gave the money to Obama. What Obama did is he declared money to the insurance companies as what's called a permanent appropriation. There's sort of, we don't have to get into the weeds, but there's sort of two types of appropriations, annual and permanent. Very few things are permanent because they're sort of like giving the president a credit card. So when you get your tax refund, they don't have to go to Congress and say, this is how much money we're going to refund. It's a permanent appropriation. So Congress said, just go ahead and pay them their refund. Congress is very careful on what things are declared a permanent appropriation because it opens up the Treasury. So what Obama did is he just said, I'm now just going to treat, I'm going to say that you wanted this to be a permanent appropriation even though you never said it. So he loses on that, even if he had an emergency declaration. Now, he could use these areas that we're discussing that are enumerated for emergency declarations, but it would not have affected any money going to the insurance companies.
All right, it is time for closing arguments in this spectacular debate. The goal is to sum up as intensely and succinctly as possible your arguments, and then the audience will vote one more time. And Rich Lowry, the first closing argument is to you. Why does the president lack the constitutional and legal authority to build the wall?
I'm not going to wear out my welcome by repeating everything I've already said multiple times. So I'll just say this is an amazing place that honors a truly stupendous achievement in human history. Jeffrey walked us through the hall, the signers there before we came in. And it's just amazing. These were just men. These were just men, but they had thought through what is the best system to govern ourselves and to protect our liberties, and have an executive that had a lot of power and energy, but that was still controlled. And it's worked. You know, it's worked for a couple centuries now. And Lincoln talked about how they were heroes, and they had heroic revolutionary struggle prior to the drafting of the Constitution, and how going forward and preserving that legacy is kind of a more mundane task, in some ways harder than that. And that's why we just need every element of our civic life rowing the same direction to promote reverence for this incredible system. Wherever you are on the political system, spectrum, left, right, or center, this system is incredible. It's the best in human history. It must be preserved. And that's why you must vote no on this question, to preserve that very system. But thanks so much to everyone for being here. It's been a wonderful experience.
Don't leave yet.
Thank you so much for that. And Jonathan Turley, the last word is to you. Please tell the audience why the president lacks the constitutional and legal authority to build the wall.
No, has the authority.
Has,
right,
forgive
yes.
me. Has the authority.
well, first of all, part of the burden of being a constitutional law professor is that you're almost always called to Congress by the minority because members rarely come to appreciate the Constitution until they're out of power. And part of the burden then, the test of principle, is that it takes you places that you don't personally want to be. Principle often requires you to say that even a president you disagree with is using authority previously granted to his predecessors. And it's a terrible burden, but he is using that authority. He's using authority to declare a declaration which even Rich has conceded he has. And the question then comes, can he use money in any of these 5 areas? Rich has only talked about one of them. And the answer is yes. He might not prevail in all 5. He just has to prevail in a couple to build this wall. Now, I started out by talking about Holmes and how he would gladly send Congress to hell. One time he was on a train and a conductor went up to him to get his ticket and he couldn't find it. And the conductor said, "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Holmes, I know who you are." And Holmes said, "So do I. The question is, where am I going?" And that is a question that all have to ask themselves, because one of the greatest dangers to our system that is celebrated in this wonderful building is if our judges lose that clear definition of what the scope of their conduct requires, of their function. And their function is not to make policy decisions. It unfortunately is much like constitutional witnesses, often forced to uphold uniquely stupid, moronic acts by Congress or a president. That's their function, because they are not the least dangerous branch if they start to make policy decisions. So we are left with the chilling fact that we get the government that we create. When Benjamin Franklin said that famous line, and she said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And he said, "It's a republic, madam, if you can keep it." That's what makes those words so chilling. Because what Benjamin Franklin was saying is that every democratic system has the seeds of its own destruction. Every generation has to renew this covenant of faith to protect the system. And sometimes that means that we have to support the system to act fairly and neutrally. Our problem in this matter is our Congress gave too much power to the president. But we don't correct that by asking a judge to do what Congress failed to do. And so if it's a republic that you want to keep, take yourself to Congress, not the courts, and Trump wins this one.
All right, I'm going to ask you to vote in a second, but first I have to say that although I've used several superlatives to describe this evening's debate, it is so striking that both of our debaters have ended by encouraging you to separate your politics from your constitutional judgments, and therefore for promoting reason versus passion in the highest tradition of the National Constitution Center, please join me sincerely in thanking both of our debaters.
Thank you.
Great. Bravo. All right, it is time to vote again using your phones, which seemed to work really well the last time, and therefore I will ask you once again to text your votes. The motion is the president has the legal and constitutional authority to build the wall. Text 215-515-9917. Text 1 if your answer is yes, the president does have the constitutional or legal authority to build the wall. Text no if your answer is no, the president does not have the constitutional or legal authority to build the wall. That's texting 2. And if you're still undecided, text 3. And I guess we're going to continue to... My goodness. We're going to tally the final result afterward and tweet out the answer. But what I'm seeing here in real time, here in this Brexit-like experience, where we're watching the exit polls be tallied, is what appears to be a shift from no to yes. And in the end, the winner will be the side that has shifted most votes. So let me ask you, if you finished texting, who changed his or her mind based on the result that you heard? That is a remarkable and unusually large shift, and therefore I am. And who changed his or her mind from no to yes? And who changed from yes to no? All right, it's too soon for me to issue a definitive judgment. We're going to have to watch our Twitter feed at constitutioncenter.org for the final tally. But for opening, and this is the final question, whose mind was open to the arguments on the other side? Bravo. Please join me in thanking our debaters. Thanks to all of you.
That was great. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Really excellent.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's absolutely
It
superb.
just shows that even the small